Let me tell you something that might surprise you. The person who pulls away the moment you get close isn't always the strong, emotionless figure they appear to be. In fact, what looks like indifference is often fear in disguise. They won't say it. They'll brush it off, laugh it off, or disappear altogether before they ever admit what's really going on underneath. But just because they don't talk about it doesn't mean it's not there. Avoidants have fears, deep ones, that shape how they love, how they connect, and how they push people away. And once you understand those fears, everything starts to make sense. So if you've ever been confused by someone who runs hot and cold, or wondered why someone shuts down the moment things get real, this is going to give you clarity and maybe even a little compassion. Avoidants often walk through life with an armor that looks a lot like strength. They're fiercely independent, they pride themselves on self-sufficiency, and they tend to keep people at arm's length, not because they don't like connection, but because it feels like a threat. One of their most deeply buried fears, one they would likely never say out loud, is the fear that emotional dependence will make them lose control. This isn't just about being in a relationship. It's about what it means to rely on someone, to need someone, and how that threatens the very identity they've built for themselves. For an avoidant, control is safety. Control means knowing where they stand, being the master of their own emotions, and never being at the mercy of someone else's decisions, inconsistencies, or failures. Emotional dependence feels like handing the wheel to someone else and hoping they don't drive the car into a wall. To someone with an avoidant attachment style, that is terrifying because deep down there's a belief that needing someone gives that person the power to hurt you, manipulate you, or even leave you. And if that happens, they don't trust that they'll be okay on the other side. They've probably learned this belief somewhere. Maybe it was a parent who was inconsistent, loving one day, distant the next, or a partner who demanded closeness but then used that intimacy to guilt trip or control. Or maybe they were simply never taught that needing someone could be safe. Whatever the origin, it planted a seed. Never let anyone get close enough to have that kind of power. Never need anyone so much that their absence could shake your world. So what do? They build a life where they're always in control. They become hyper-independent, convincing themselves they don't need help, they don't need comfort, they don't need anyone to lean on. They create boundaries that are more like walls. And when someone does come along who offers love, support, and closeness, their instincts kick in, not to receive, but to retreat. They fear being trapped. They fear being swallowed by someone else's emotions or expectations. And they fear that the minute they begin to depend on someone, they'll stop being who they are. Even in relationships, they keep a part of themselves off limits. They might be charming, present, and engaging, but there's a line you're not allowed to cross. And if you try to cross it, if you start needing more, asking for vulnerability, or showing your own emotional dependence, they feel the walls closing in. That's when you might see them start to pull away, become distant, or even pick fights just to create space. It's not that they don't care, it's that caring feels risky. Because the more they care, the more they open themselves up to needing you, and the more they need you, the more vulnerable they become. In their mind, needing someone makes them weak. It makes them exposed. And worst of all, it makes them capable of being hurt in a way they might not know how to recover from. So rather than risk that, they try to stay in control. They avoid dependence by being the one who always gives a little less, who loves with one foot out the door, who keeps just enough emotional distance to feel safe. But that safety comes at a cost, because even though they may feel protected, they're also disconnected. They miss out on the depth of intimacy that comes from being able to fully show up, to lean into another person, and to know that it's okay to be human, to need, to feel, to depend. This fear isn't always visible from the outside. In fact, people often look at avoidance as emotionally unavailable or distant without understanding the anxiety that drives that behavior. They don't see the mental tug of war, the part that craves connection battling with the part that's terrified of what that connection could cost. They don't see how exhausting it can be to constantly stay in control, to never let anyone see the soft spots. And most importantly, they don't see the longing underneath it all. the part of the avoidant that wishes they could just relax into love without fear of losing themselves. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, vulnerability is not just uncomfortable, it feels dangerous. There's a deeply rooted belief, often buried beneath layers of calm detachment and emotional independence, that opening up is the same as exposing a weakness. Vulnerability is associated with risk, and not just any risk. The kind of risk that threatens their emotional safety, their self-concept, and their ability to stay in control. It isn't that avoidants don't feel deeply. On the contrary, they can feel intensely. But what they've learned, somewhere along the way, is that showing those feelings makes them susceptible to pain, judgment, or abandonment. The avoidant has often built their identity on being self-reliant. They may have grown up in environments where emotions weren't safe to express, where crying was met with indifference or opening up was used against them. Maybe they watched someone in their life fall apart after letting their guard down, or maybe they themselves were once vulnerable and it ended in betrayal or heartbreak. Whatever the source, it taught them this: don't let anyone see too much. Don't reveal what really hurts. Don't share what makes you feel small, scared, or insecure. Keep your cards close, keep your face neutral, and never let them know they've touched a nerve. So when intimacy begins to build and someone starts asking for their truth, what they feel, what they fear, what they want, it activates something in them that feels like a silent alarm. The walls go up almost instinctively. They might change the subject, deflect with humor, or intellectualize the situation instead of staying in the emotional space. It's not because they're trying to be difficult, it's because their nervous system interprets vulnerability as exposure and exposure as a potential threat. In their internal world, love often feels like a battlefield disguised as connection. This leads to a kind of emotional self-protection that can seem cold or indifferent to others. An avoidant might seem calm when things go wrong, unbothered by conflict, or even distant in moments that typically call for closeness. That's not because they don't care, it's because they've trained themselves not to show it. Vulnerability, in their mind, opens the door to being rejected, manipulated, or controlled. And so they resist it at all costs. It becomes a survival strategy, one that prioritizes safety over connection and control over closeness. In relationships, this fear shows up in subtle but powerful ways. When a partner shares something vulnerable, the avoidant may listen but not reciprocate. When asked how they feel, they might respond with something vague or surface level. They may avoid deep conversations or become uncomfortable when emotions rise. And if someone gets too close, emotionally or physically, they might instinctively create distance, either by pulling back affection or by creating conflict to restore emotional space. They are constantly trying to manage the tension between the desire for intimacy and the fear of being truly seen. There's also the fear of how others will perceive them if they do open up. Vulnerability requires revealing not just feelings, but flaws, insecurities, doubts, emotional wounds. For someone who has always tried to stay strong and in control, this kind of exposure can feel humiliating. There's a belief that if someone sees the mess underneath, they'll lose respect, lose interest, or worst of all, use that information to hurt them. So rather than risk being misunderstood or rejected, avoidants often choose silence. They keep their feelings inside, process them alone, and show the world only what feels safe to show. This also leads to internal conflict, because while they fear vulnerability, they also crave authenticity. Deep down, they want to be known. They want to be loved not just for how they appear, but for who they truly are. They want to feel safe enough to say, I'm struggling, I'm scared, or I need you, without fearing that doing so will shatter their sense of identity or power. But that craving often goes unmet because the fear of what vulnerability could cost them overrides the desire for what it might give them. They become masters of subtle avoidance, giving just enough to keep someone close but never enough to feel exposed. They might be kind, generous, even loving in their own way, but emotionally, there's a ceiling. You only get so far before you hit the invisible line they've drawn. And behind that line is everything they're afraid to reveal. The pain, the confusion, the longing, the fear that they are not enough or that if they were truly known, they would not be chosen. One of the deepest and most hidden fears avoidants carry is the fear of being truly seen and then rejected. This isn't the kind of rejection most people think about, the kind that comes from a bad date or a failed relationship. This is a far more personal, more piercing fear. It's the belief that if someone gets too close, if they really see all the parts of them they've worked so hard to hide, that person will no longer want them. It's the fear that beneath the surface they've spent a lifetime curating, is something too flawed, too damaged, too complicated to be loved. Avoidants often come across as confident, composed, even emotionally impenetrable. But that image is crafted very carefully. It's not a reflection of how safe they feel. It's a reflection of how much they need to protect themselves. The persona they present to the world is typically one that feels safe to show. Competent, independent, self-sufficient, maybe even emotionally together. But this persona exists in direct contrast to the parts of themselves they are terrified to reveal, the parts that feel anxious, needy, unsure, or insecure. In their minds, those parts are unacceptable. Those parts are the ones they believe others will turn away from if they're ever exposed. This belief often comes from early experiences, whether from family, childhood friends, or even early romantic partners, where emotional honesty was met with rejection, judgment, or neglect. Maybe they opened up once and were told to toughen up. Maybe they asked for love and it was withheld. Maybe they were told explicitly or indirectly that being too much emotionally made them a burden. So they learned to split themselves. They learned to show only what felt safe and keep everything else locked away. And over time, this split became part of who they are. But the problem with hiding yourself is that you can never fully feel accepted. Even when someone says they love them, avoidants often have a quiet thought in the back of their mind, but they don't know the real me. They assume that if their partner saw all of them, their moments of insecurity, their emotional needs, their fears of abandonment, they would walk away. This creates a sense of emotional disconnection, even in relationships that seem close on the surface. Because how can you feel truly loved when you don't believe the other person even knows the full truth of who you are? This fear also causes them to be highly sensitive to perceived threats of rejection. If someone criticizes them, pulls away emotionally, or expresses frustration, they may react more strongly than expected. Not outwardly. They often appear calm or dismissive, but internally it can reinforce the belief that they're unworthy as they are. So rather than stay present in those moments, they might shut down, withdraw, or even end the relationship preemptively. They figure it's better to leave on their own terms than wait for the inevitable moment when the other person sees too much and decides they don't want them anymore. This is also why many avoidants keep emotional intimacy at a low simmer. They're careful about how much they share and when. They might open up a little, just enough to create a sense of closeness, but then pull back when they feel it's going too far. They may offer vulnerability in controlled doses, often after they feel completely safe and in control of the situation. And even then, there's usually a limit. Once the closeness reaches a certain point, the fear kicks in. What if they see something in me I haven't shown? What if they don't like it? What if I lose them? This fear of being seen and then rejected also makes it difficult for avoidants to fully enjoy emotional intimacy. Even in the best moments, there's often a lingering tension, like they're waiting for the other shoe to drop, like they're hoping their partner doesn't look too closely, ask too many questions, or get too curious about what's going on beneath the surface. And if their partner does try to go deeper, it can feel invasive, even though that person's intention is usually love. To the avoidant, deeper connection often triggers defense, not gratitude, because connection to them means risk. They carry this fear quietly, often without fully acknowledging it, even to themselves. They might dismiss it as needing space or not being ready, but what they're really afraid of is being emotionally naked, of standing in front of someone without their protective mask and hearing, "I don't want you." And so they build emotional structures around themselves, habits, attitudes, even entire life philosophies that protect them from ever having to stand in that vulnerable place. They become experts in keeping people just far enough away to avoid being truly exposed, while simultaneously longing for the kind of connection that can only happen when someone sees you fully and stays anyway. One of the most misunderstood but powerful fears avoidants carry is the belief that commitment equals the end of their freedom. To someone on the outside, this can look like fear of settling down, reluctance to define the relationship, or a general resistance to long-term plans involving another person. But beneath that surface hesitation lies something far deeper and more complex. It's not just about fearing routine or losing novelty. It's about the belief that entering a committed relationship will cost them their autonomy, their identity, and their ability to move through life on their own terms. Avoidants are often highly protective of their independence. It's not just a preference, it's a form of emotional self-preservation. They've spent much of their lives learning how to rely on themselves, how to stay self-contained, how to avoid needing anyone else in order to feel secure. And because they've built so much of their emotional safety around this independence, the idea of letting someone in deeply, consistently, and over time feels like stepping into a cage. It doesn't matter how loving or supportive the partner is. The relationship itself represents a kind of loss, the loss of space, of control, of the ability to make decisions without compromise. In their internal world, commitment is often associated with obligation. It's not simply the act of choosing someone, it's the fear of being required to give up parts of themselves to keep the other person happy. They imagine a future where their time, choices, energy, and even emotions are no longer entirely their own. And this imagined loss of freedom doesn't feel like partnership, it feels like self-erasure. So instead of moving toward commitment with openness, they often view it as something to manage, delay, or avoid altogether. This fear gets reinforced by the cultural narrative that relationships require sacrifice. Everywhere they turn, they hear stories of people losing themselves in love, giving up dreams, compromising too much, becoming dependent, or staying in situations that stifle them. For the avoidant, who already fears emotional suffocation, these stories serve as warnings. They begin to associate closeness with limitation. The more serious the relationship becomes, the more they start to look for the exits, not because they don't care, but because they're scared that caring too much will require giving up parts of themselves they've worked so hard to protect. So they often keep one foot out the door. Even when they're in a relationship, they maintain a psychological escape hatch. Maybe they avoid labels, or they resist long-term planning. Maybe they keep emotional distance even while appearing physically close. They may hesitate to merge their lives with someone else, moving in together, sharing finances, building future goals, because each of those steps feels like another thread tying them down. And the more entangled they feel, the more anxious they become. This internal tension can show up in many different ways. Some avoidants may over-focus on their career or personal goals as a way to keep emotional dependence at bay. Others might romanticize the idea of freedom, solo travel, living alone, staying unattached, not because they don't want love, but because love has come to represent a kind of trap. They may even sabotage good relationships, not because the person is wrong for them, but because the relationship itself triggers the fear that they'll lose their sense of self if they stay. At the heart of this fear is a fundamental misunderstanding of what real commitment can be. They often believe that to be committed is to be consumed, that to be close to someone is to give up their agency. They imagine that once they say yes to love, they will no longer be able to say yes to themselves. And because of that belief, they build internal walls to protect their freedom, walls that keep them safe, but also keep them alone. This fear is rarely expressed directly. Avoidants may say they're not ready or that they need more time. They might talk about wanting to focus on personal growth or explore life before settling down. But underneath those words is a deep-seated anxiety that loving someone long-term will cost them more than they're willing to pay. They're not avoiding commitment because they don't want love. They're avoiding it because they fear that commitment means giving up the very thing that has always made them feel safe, their independence. And so they keep love at a distance, not to hurt others, but to protect themselves from a kind of emotional captivity they fear they won't survive. There is a fear buried so deep within many avoidantly attached individuals that even they may not be fully aware of it. It doesn't always show up in words or actions that are easy to trace, but it colors the way they view relationships, how they respond to intimacy, and how they handle closeness. It's the fear that they are unlovable just as they are, not because of something they've done or a specific flaw, but because they carry a quiet, persistent belief that if anyone were to truly know them, to see beyond the well-managed image they present, there would be something there that disqualifies them from being fully accepted. This fear is often masked by pride, by competence, by being calm and in control. Avoidants tend to develop a polished outer shell. They excel in areas where performance is rewarded. They lean into strengths that make them feel capable and self-reliant. And for a while, that surface confidence works. It helps them navigate life without needing too much from others. It lets them create the illusion that they're fine, always fine. But beneath that shell is usually a different story, one marked by self-doubt, emotional insecurity, and the belief that needing love, expressing pain, or showing weakness will ultimately cost them the very connection they long for. Many avoidants learned early on that being emotional didn't lead to closeness. It led to withdrawal, criticism, or abandonment. They may have had caregivers who were emotionally unavailable or inconsistent, present sometimes, but cold or rejecting when emotional needs came to the surface. From these early experiences, they internalized a dangerous message. Your emotions make you hard to love. Your needs are too much. Your full self is not welcome here. So they began to adapt. They learned how to minimize their emotions, suppress their needs, and make themselves smaller to stay connected to the people around them. But the cost of that adaptation was authenticity. As adults, this shows up in a persistent feeling that they must earn love rather than receive it freely. They might not say it out loud, but their behavior reflects it. They believe love is conditional, that they are lovable only when they are useful, composed, attractive, competent, or low maintenance. This belief turns relationships into performances. They show the parts of themselves they believe are acceptable and hide the rest. And even when someone offers them unconditional love, it doesn't quite register. Deep down, they suspect that if they ever stopped performing, if they ever let their guard down entirely, that love would disappear. This fear becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because they believe they're unlovable at their core, they keep people at a distance. They avoid deep emotional expression. They don't allow themselves to be truly known. And because of that, others never get the chance to love them fully. Only the curated version they present. This distance protects them from rejection, but it also prevents them from experiencing the very thing they want most, to be loved for who they are, not who they pretend to be. Over time, this creates a painful cycle. The more they hide, the more unseen they feel. The more unseen they feel, the more convinced they become that they are unlovable. Even in their most intimate relationships, this fear lingers. When a partner offers praise or affection, they might accept it on the surface, but internally dismiss it, thinking that the person only loves the version they've been shown, not the whole picture. They might downplay compliments, deflect emotional connection, or question the sincerity of their partner's feelings. They may even push people away during moments of vulnerability, not because they don't care, but because they're afraid that if they truly open up, the other person will leave. Better to keep the illusion alive than risk revealing what they fear is unworthy underneath. This belief also makes it difficult for avoidants to fully receive love. When someone tries to love them deeply, they can become suspicious, defensive, or even resentful. Part of them wants to believe it's real, but another part whispers that it can't last, that if they relax into it, they'll eventually be exposed and rejected. So they stay guarded. They accept love in limited amounts. They keep their emotional world hidden not because they're cold or incapable, but because they're protecting a wound they've carried for a very long time. The wound of not feeling fundamentally lovable just as they are. And as long as that belief remains unexamined, it quietly shapes every relationship they enter, keeping real closeness just out of reach.